This is an oral history interview with Dr. Joseph Allman Jr. in his home on June 6, 1984. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Dr. Allman, where was your father born and what was his name?
Father's name was Joseph F. Allman, same as mine, Joseph Francis Allman. He was born in Monticello Township, about 5 miles east of town. Born year, I don't really recall. He was 60 years of age when he died.
Did they have a farm out there?
Yes. He was a member of a family with 7 children. And my grandfather obtained some of the land from the Illinois Central, or Illinois Gulf Central Railroad, so that it's been in the family over 100 years.
Does the family still own the land?
I still own 320 acres of it. I guess I'm the only, no, I have a cousin, and he's dead now, that lived in California, that owned about 180. Mm-hmm. The total land in that area that my grandfather owned was 1,000 acres.
When did your grandfather come to Piatt County?
Came to Piatt County in 1854. He was approximately 16 years of age.
Do you know how he happened to come here?
He came from Ireland, so the potato famine is what has always been said.
Uh-huh. Was he the only one of his family?
He had a brother. Well, he had several brothers that came into the area. There was a Patrick Allman. In fact, the first piece of land that my grandfather obtained was a 40-acre plot that his brother gave him. Then he also had there was a John Allman, and I never did understand what became of John. He also had a brother, Ed Allman, who owned about 300 acres of land in the same area where my grandfather farmed. And he was unmarried and brought a niece from Ireland to be his housekeeper. So that even though the name Allman is German, or Alsace-Lorraine, I guess, and once we went back to Ireland to kind of look into this and learn that the name was originally Allman, and then was anglicized to Allman. My grandfather, well, actually, when he went out into that area, it was all swamp, marsh, and with drainage and so forth, it became tillable. And he was in cattle business, raised livestock.
What was your mother's name, and what area was she born in?
She was born in Champaign County, and I'm not sure whether she was born in Isedale area or over around Tolona. Her name was Ruth Gunning. And she was second generation Irish also.
So they're both from originally, their families?
2 families are both from Ireland.
Did her father have farmland in the area?
He had some farmland around Isedale. I think he had 160 acres is what his holdings were.
Do you know how much education your parents had?
My father went to college for 4 years. He got booted out before he got a degree. And
Did he go to the University of
No, he went to St. Mary's College in Kansas. And he said he was kind of an educated fool, is what he called himself at that time, because he'd had no preparation to really to follow a field. He had a real liberal arts education. At one time he could speak Latin and speak it rather fluently. So he determined, he gave me a choice. I could become a doctor or a lawyer.
Oh, because you could speak Latin.
No, simply because he had not prepared for any field to really pursue.
Is that how you really chose becoming a doctor?
Pretty much so. He wanted me to have a profession. And fortunately, I was able to do that.
Do you have any idea of the schooling that your mother had?
My mother had a high school education, and she went to school at a Sacred Heart Academy in Springfield.
So in those days, they would have both been fairly highly educated.
Pretty well educated for a period of time in which they were reared.
What did your father do after college?
He did a little bit of everything. He worked as a laborer, always as a laborer. He worked with construction. I think maybe he became a bricklayer. He also had a theater for a good number of years. He had the Avon Theater in Decatur, and he had, at that time, there were two theaters in Monticello, and I think the name of the theater which he had was the Globe.
So
It wasn't until 1928 or 29 that he got into farming.
he went back to farm the family farm?
He went back and farmed the land that was left to him by his father.
The theaters that you mentioned, now they were the type that showed movies over.
Yes.
They weren't like vaudeville or that type.
No. It was a movie theater, and the Globe, I don't imagine it ever had anything but a Western.
Yeah. Where was the Globe Theater located?
It was in that building which Larry Zemer has his art or gallery, and where the travel agency is. So it wasn't too large.
When did that theater close?
I think maybe that probably closed around 1924 or 25.
So it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Where were you born?
I was born in Monticello. Of course, at that time we were born at home.
So your parents lived in Monticello
Yes.
at the time. Where did they live?
Lived down on West William Street at the time I was born.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had none.
Where did you go to school then?
I went through grade school and high school here in Monticello, and then the rest of my training was at the University of Illinois.
Did you grow up in town then?
Yes, pretty much. After my father obtained the land east of town, we lived out there for approximately 3 years, and that was during what we know as the Great Depression. Pretty rough times. One thing I recall that my father shelled all the corn out of his crib, which held 12,000 bushel of corn. By the time he'd paid for the shelling and so forth, got his check from the elevator, gave me the check to take into the bank, and it was less than $1,000. That paid his interest and his taxes for the year.
So you were living on the farm during the part of the Depression?
Part of the Depression. We lived out there from 1930 to 33.
What other things do you recall of the Depression?
Well, everybody was in it. I mean, there were no great wealthy people, and I do recall that, of course, both banks went under, And they weren't money merchants, but they seemed to have the cash, and that was Pete and Bill Bacopoulos. And they ran a restaurant here in Monticello for years. They had one on the west side of the square, probably where Schuer's
The hardware
store is now, and called the Sugar Bowl. And it was get a good nice ice cream cone for a nickel and this type of thing. Then they later were over on the north side of the square, which, in fact, the National Bank bought that building out, and when they extended their bank.
So did they lend money to people?
They lent money, and with the freeze and so forth, they knew many of the people would eventually get their money back out of the banks, or they hoped that they would, and so they were really looking back. They were great people. The town was fortunate to have them.
And they really took a chance, too.
Yeah.
Did your father lose any money when the banks closed?
Not really. As I said on that check, 12,000 bushel of corn. So the price of that corn was about 9 cents a bushel. He didn't have much money to have in the bank, but he did well to come out of the Depression and hold the farm together.
Yeah, because a lot of people didn't.
No, remember the foreclosures? Maybe you've never seen them they would go and buy the equipment. Because at that time, most of your farming was horse. By horses, that was the main power. And the neighbors would buy the equipment, buy a plow maybe for $3, and it was pretty well understood that nobody did very much. And then they would turn around and sell it back to the man being foreclosed. I don't know how legal that was, but
well, they had to do something.
But one of the trademarks of a foreclosure sale was a hay barn door hanging down with a noose up in the opening. Oh, those were I don't remember being frightened, but it was a weird feeling, though.
I imagine. What type of chores did you do on the farm when you were growing up?
Well, I was just out of 8th grade. Couldn't wait to learn how to milk. Was sorry that I ever learned.
They took advantage of it.
I got the chore to do all the time.
About how many cows did...
We just had 2 cows, just enough for the family. Although my mother would barter her butter at the grocery store. And my father bought an old blind Jersey. Real fine cow, except she was blind. But she could always find the farthest end of the pasture. When it came time to milk her, well, morning or night, I had to walk about a quarter mile to get her and lead her by the horn into the barn. And I finally learned that, well, maybe I can milk her out there, but I spilled the milk too much carrying it back.
Yeah.
I really didn't participate except during summer months. But he gave me a team, a Jenny mule and a roan mare, which was my team, and I plowed the corn, beans, hauled grain to the elevator when they would have the thrashing ring.
Did they have a hired man or?
Only part-time. And of course, he lived in the house with us.
Was there anybody else that lived with you as you were growing up?
Yes, for a couple of years, and that was when things were really bad. My mother's sister and her husband and 2 children lived with us till he could find employment. And of course, this was a real bonus for my father because he was really quite a good mechanic. And last year, when we started with the power farming or use of tractors and so forth, he could keep the old Model T running and the old tractor going, and the engines that we had to pump water and on the windmill and all of this, and so that.
So he would be quite useful.
Oh yeah, he was probably helped my father make it through there.
When you lived in town when you were younger, which grade school did you attend?
Attended the Washington School. I went to the Lincoln School one year because for some reason or other, the whole 6th grade in the system at that time were sent up to the Lincoln School regardless of which part of town you lived in.
About how many kids would have been in your grade?
I would say 30, maybe 35.
Did you walk to school?
Yes,
Did you come home for lunch at that time?
we sure did. No school lunches.
Yeah.
I lived on the farm. I then brought a lunch box.
What type of games do you remember playing after school or during recess?
Oh, blind man's bluff. A take off on soccer, baseball, usual sports after 8th grade or 7th and 8th grade. Why then was usually your organized sports. Almost we all participated in.
Do you recall some of your teachers' names?
Recall one very vividly, Miss Valentine. I'm sure if you've interviewed others that don't remember her first name, but she was the 1st grade teacher. I think she must have been a saint. But she was a tremendous teacher. And she had 3 of my daughters when they started the school. And my oldest daughter hit that period of time where they didn't use any of the accents on the vowels and so forth. Phonics. I think maybe it's phonics that she taught, and they did away with that.
Yes.
Flashcards and so forth. And my oldest daughter missed the phonics. She never did learn how to spell properly.
I think I went to school at the same time.
And but she never stopped teaching her 1st graders phonics. And, I have another friend. He moved away from here, went to California right after his 1st year in school. He always remembers her as being the greatest.
Yeah.
Pearl Mosgrove, Catherine Castle. Catherine's still living. Worth Lacey, an art teacher. Beagleheimer. I think maybe she is still living. In high school, J.K. Felch, still living. Buck Schroth, one of our better known citizens now. Raymond Quinlan, Seabold sisters, Mildred Fleming, Sims, Ernie Lukens, Art Bergstrom. I can remember most of them.
Yeah, you're remembering quite a few. Who were some of the boys that were your friends that you grew up with?
Well, Steve Kratz was probably one of my closest friends. Len Norris, Bob Foster, Henry Dighton, John Dighton, Don Pyatt, Robert Cole, John Blacker, William Fosnaw, Al Seiler. Oh, there are many, many more.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the ones I remember very well. John Hartsfield, Robert Tull, Roy Seffin. Well, there's more.
When you think back about Monticello as you were a young boy growing up, what was the town like?
Oh, they've had quite a few changes in town, but not anything very startling. I think anybody had grown up at the time I did in Monticello and went away for 50 years and came back, they wouldn't find the square too much different. Where the post office is, there used to be a hitching post for horse-drawn carriages and so forth. Allerton Library's the same as it was. Professional building and is one of the newer buildings. But the square itself has really changed very little. Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church are still their old locations. And there were always two banks. Or there wasn't always. There Moore's State Bank, when it reopened, it became the National Bank. And the first State Bank of Monticello didn't open until probably 39 or 40. And always called the Dighton Bank, never did reopen its doors. But it paid off 107 cents on the dollar.
So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
After you finished high school, then you went on to college.
Went to college. I went for 2 years of pre-med at Champaign, Urbana. Then 4 years of med school in Chicago.
What kind of requirements did they have then? Did you have to do a residency someplace?
At that time, the only requirement was 1 year, what they called a rotating internship after school. And now everybody's a resident. And they aren't all what we call a rotating. I mean, you'd have so many weeks in surgery, so many weeks in internal medicine, so many weeks in pediatrics, orthopedics, ear, nose, and throat. I guess the family residents or residencies for family practitioners, they have the rotating type of thing. But you can, if you're going to be a surgeon, you can just start in with what they call a surgical residency.
Where
Many more requirements today to become a licensed physician.
Where did you do your rotating internship then?
It's City Hospital in St. Louis. And then I finished up the internship in Navy Hospital in San Diego.
So you joined the Navy then after you finished?
I was in the
medical
reserve so I could get through school. When the
Now, what year did you finish medical school?
1942. And when we all had to register for the draft, almost every medical students either joined the Army Reserve or the Navy Reserve, so that we could. That way, the local draft board would let you continue or finish your education before you would be subject to draft. And if you joined the reserve, why you were subject to military obligation.
Where did you serve then?
In the military, signed to the Marines out of Dago, and I was in Central Pacific most of the time during the war.
Did you see much action?
Not too much. I was at Bougainville, Tinian, and Okinawa. Those are the three areas in which I was at the time, while they were still, battles were still going on.
What kind of medical, what kind of hospitals and what were the conditions like?
Well, I was in what they called a battalion surgeon, and really I just ran a sick bay. But they had field hospitals. It's probably a good deal like MASH, although they had male nurses. I mean, they didn't have.
There weren't the female.
No, there was not the female nurses. And then they would have back in the back areas, why then they'd have pretty good setups for their hospitals. Dr. Green was in a field hospital. And I saw him once in Okinawa.
That's strange that you would meet like that.
I met very few people I had known before. Now, coming home from the Pacific, at that time, I thought I'd be home and have a month's leave and be right back out. Everybody felt that way. And of course, the poor Marines, didn't get home, but I was attached to the Marines, and they'd send them. Supposed to have had an 18-month tour of duty with the Marines, and then you would be reassigned. And the physicians or the officers, they got to come home. But that was right after Okinawa had been secured, and the next push we thought would be either Formosa or Taiwan now, or Japan itself. Figured we'd be back out there. But then the war. In fact, the day I landed in San Diego, the Japs surrendered, so I never had to go back out.
Which you didn't mind at all.
I was not very unhappy.
What was the feeling when you heard that they dropped the atomic bomb? How did people react?
I guess we had no idea of the destruction. We knew it was a terrific event, but it wasn't until the Japs surrendered shortly after that second bomb was dropped. We began to have some idea what this must have been. But we had no conception of what it was, and I didn't until much later in life.
So you came home then? Were you all done with the service?
I was through with the service at that time.
And did you come back to Monticello at that point?
After I was discharged from the Navy in Norfolk, Virginia, came back to Monticello then and was a house physician for the Wabash Railroad for approximately 6 or 7 months, and then I started practicing.
Now, what does that involve? Where were you located?
Indicator, hospital, or the Wabash Employees Hospital Association.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a general hospital. Quite a bit of orthopedics, surgery, medicine. It was a good experience.
Had you always planned to come back to Monticello and
Yes.
practice? When did you meet your wife?
Met her while I was in medical school. Through one of my classmates. We were having a fraternity party, and I didn't have a date, and he says, well, I'll get you one. We ended up getting married.
So it was a blind date that turned out.
The blind date, that turned out well.
So was she from the Chicago area then?
She took her training in nursing at St. Joseph's Hospital in Chicago. Known each other about 2 years at that time.
Where were you married?
Married in St. Mary's Church in Delavan, Illinois.
And so then she stayed here or there when you went into the service?
When I went into the service, she spent part of her time here with my folks and part of the time with her folks in Delavan and some time with an aunt in Chicago. She kind of shifted around.
How many children did you have?
4. 3 daughters and a son. My oldest daughter is 41, I guess now. And my son is 34. It doesn't seem possible.
No. After you got out of the service, then did you and your wife live in Decatur for a while?
We lived down there for the period of time that I was at the Wabash Hospital, and then of course we've lived here ever since I started in practice, which was in January of 1947.
Where did you live in Monticello when you first came?
We lived in what we call it the Charlie McIntosh house, and that could be confusing to some people, but where Charles McIntosh lives now, which is right at the end of Main Street. It's a nice brick home there. I think we lived there about 2-3 years, and then we have lived where we presently live since 1950.
What were the other doctors in town when you began practicing?
I'd have to stop and think whether Dr. Holmes was still alive then or not. Yes, he was still living. I don't think he was practicing. Dr. Hume, Dr. Furry. During the war years, really Dr. Furry was the only doctor here in Monticello. The rest were in the service.
As you were growing up, do you recall who the doctors were?
There was a Dr. Bumstead. He was mayor of Monticello several times. He was a very active gentleman. He had a very, very keen sense of humor. Dr. Bumstead, or not Dr. Bumstead, Dr. Holmes. And Then Dr. Furry. I think Dr. Furry came here right after World War One, and Dr. Hume came in and was here several years before he went into service, and then came back, and he's only back about 2 years, and then he went into the Veterans Administration program.
When somebody was seriously ill when you were growing up, was there a hospital in Monticello at that point?
No.
Where did they take them?
Either had to go to Champaign or Decatur, and the two hospitals in Decatur are still there. Decatur in Macon County, which is Decatur Memorial now, St. Mary's Hospital. And in Champaign, I believe there was only one hospital in Champaign at that time, and that was Mercy. And so if you had a real serious problem, you had to leave. 1940 was the year that John and Mary Kirby opened their doors. 41 maybe. Can't recall for sure. It could have been 1941.
So you always had the advantages of having a hospital in town.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What are some of the greatest changes you've seen in the medical profession?
Well, probably I know more about it than I have seen it. Although I've been beneficiary of it too, is I would say the advance in technology. Medical technology is, I don't know how much further it can go, but I'm sure it will go tremendous amount. Electrocardiograms were not in their infancy, but they were not too plentiful either at the time I was growing up, or when we first started practicing, or when I first started practicing. X-ray probably be described primitive with today's standards. X-ray of the lung, for fractures. That was about the extent that we used it. Wasn't until several years after I was in practice that all in your larger cities and your centers and so forth, they were doing GI series and many of the procedures that we're doing today. But the equipment itself, and the training of the specialists is so much greater that, I say, when I first started in practice, I felt I knew as much as anybody. And I probably did know quite a bit in comparison to today. The specialties is that also. When I first started in practice, we didn't have them, and surgery was the main specialty. Probably weren't too far removed from the midwives as far as OB was concerned when I went to medical school. Or at the time I was in medical school. And when I first started in practice, we didn't have all the obstetricians running around we do
and
today.
Of course there's been the big change in medicine itself. Such
Oh
as
yes,
the advent
now
of penicillin.
the advent of the antibiotics was made.
It must have been very frustrating at certain times.
And there was a time that, you had pneumonia, you either got well or you died. And if you lived through it, you sometimes didn't always get well, or people had lung abscesses, empyemas. They had to live with that the rest of their life almost. There are many diseases we don't even see today since penicillin and so forth. I once heard an ear, nose, and throat man say, well, gee, I don't know what I would do if somebody had to have a mastoidectomy. I wouldn't know how to do it. So that was a dreaded disease when I was growing up. And then, of course, preventative medicine is still.
Do you remember homes being quarantined as you were growing up?
Sure do. I sure
Were
do.
you ever quarantined?
I was when my mother had scarlet fever. I think we were quarantined for a month,
I was gonna ask
possibly 6 weeks.
What, people weren't allowed in and out of the house then?
No.
How did they get groceries in?
They would be brought,
Put on your porch and...
put on the porch, and that was a long period of time. Then afterwards, the quarantine was lifted, then they came in and fumigated the house. And that was several weeks before you got rid of all those fumes.
So it really was a long ordeal.
Yeah. And they put those placards up, and they were obeyed, because it was a dreaded disease.
When you started practicing, were you making house calls at all?
Made house calls, made many house calls. That was how you developed a practice. And as years went by, I was making more house calls several years before I retired than I did during the middle portion of it. This was primarily that I was young, of course, when I started practice, but I had some people that were not as young as I was, and as they got older, it became more and more of a problem for them to get to the office. And often after they would get there, it was time-consuming, because older people cannot take their clothes off and put them back on as fast as young people. And you could go at the home and almost do as much in the home as you could in the office, unless you had a little minor surgery to do or something of that nature. And I don't think they were neglected. I think, as I say, I think I did as well for them at home as I would have done in the office.
About when did that phase out?
When I retired. I mean,
So you still did it? You still made house
well,
calls?
I made, as I say, I made more house calls the latter years of my practice than I did through the middle years of it.
Which would be quite unusual. I don't think you would find too many.
I think some of the other doctors are beginning to.
Do you think it's something that's lacking?
No, I think it can be abused, and I think that's what the doctors are trying to avoid. There are some advantages in the office, particularly if you have an electrocardiograph machine and if you have some x-ray equipment, then this physician can offer more in the office than he can by just going by the home. But I think the other doctors, I think the public might be amazed at how many house calls are made by it's a typical joke now. You can't get the doctor to come to your home, but I think all the doctors are practicing now. I think it would be surprising just how many of them do make house calls. They make them on kind of a routine basis. Now this is going to be somewhat curtailed or relieved because of your visiting nurses now, which they is coming in, and it's good. I mean, they can draw the blood, and take it to the hospital for diabetic. And that was another area in which I had quite a few diabetics. And then we get up early in the morning and fast, go to the hospital. Some of them were almost bedridden, or you have to get the wheelchair out. Too much chore. So I always made house calls there. And I would say that I made elective house calls. I decided who I was going to go to. For somebody to call and want me to make a house call, and particularly if I'd never seen them before, I would have refused. So it's an individual basis and a doctor-patient relationship.
Do you have any idea how many children you delivered?
I would say between 1,200 and 1,500.
So that's a good share of Monticello.
That was a fair share at that time. The pill came along, and that, or there's probably been many more.
To go back a little, as you were growing up, what did you do for entertainment? Did you go to the movies?
No, we went to the movies some. Our biggest form of entertainment would be to gather in somebody's home. For 4 or 5 couples, and we'd one home one time, one home the next time. Get popcorn, candy, play Michigan rummy, dance. Summertime, when the weather was nice, picnics was a great source of entertainment because they were cheap. We didn't have a lot of spending money through the years in high school, so even though movies didn't cost $4 a ticket or $2 a ticket, whatever the price was, the movie was kind of a special occasion. During the summertime, when I was growing up, there were a lot of little fairs.
They would come to Monticello?
Well, near Monticello, Tuscola always had a fair. Arthur, Maroa, Piatt County Fair. And I grew up in the area of what they call it the big dance bands, or the big band area. In fact, we thought he was pretty good even that many years ago, and that was Perry Como with Ted Weems at Tuscola. And he was there probably 5 years in a row with Ted Weems.
So it was quite.
And those were, again, cheap entertainment. You might have to pay a quarter to get in at the fairground, then 10 cents a dance.
So that was quite common to have a dance band type.
Yes. Saturday night, Carl Mulvane, and have a dance in what's called the Old Kratz Hall. That's where the State Bank building is now. And I think Joe Hedge has an office up above the State Bank, and that pretty good sized hall. I think he charged a dime for the male and a nickel for the female. Live band.
Was the band from Monticello, or?
Usually made up from kids from Monticello or BMET, and dance would start about 8 and it'd be over about 11:30. So those were the type of things we had, but we entertained ourselves a lot.
Did you listen to radio very much?
Yes, we did.
What were your, do you have any favorite programs?
Oh, I'm trying to remember what programs you would listen to. I think when we were kids, we were probably listening to dance bands. Of course, they were always, those were mostly in the evening. They didn't have recordings. I mean, it was live radio. And we'd get music from the Trianon in Chicago, the Aragon. And Clyde McCoy, and a trumpet. He was the rage for many years. He played every noon for years, some station out of Chicago. 1 hour music by Clyde McCoy.
What were some of your other favorite bands? Did they come to Minnesota? I think
Well, we're in the area. Sometimes they'd be in Champaign or Decatur.
I was thinking someone had told me that bands would occasionally come out to the
Forest Preserve, yeah.
Preserve Park.
Yeah, Lawrence Welk was there once or twice. That was before Lawrence was as popular as he ended, but Ted Weems had a band, Jan Garber. Let's see who else, Russ Morgan, Art Castle, Wayne King. He wasn't the most popular in this area, but he was among our parents. You know, we had that generation gap then, too.
Did they think your music was just horrible?
No, they really didn't, I don't think. It wasn't that much different. I guess I grew up in what there was this so-called swing area. Swing bands.
Did you usually take a date, or was it just common to go to stag?
Usually it was in Champaign or Decatur, the Armory in Decatur is where they would hold these dances. Usually took a date there. But the country circuits usually went stag.
Did you drive a car or go in on the interurban, or?
We used both. Somebody could usually get a car from Dad. And of course it'd be 5 or 6 people in the car. I mean, nobody drove their own car. I mean, not everybody drove their own car or drove their family car.
What president do you recall most vividly as you think back?
Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think there's any doubt that he had the greatest impression on me. Harry Truman.
How did people feel about Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal and all the
Well, Franklin
changes he
Roosevelt
made?
was very unpopular in this area.
Because this is a Republican.
This is a Republican area. I always felt that I'm sure he made some mistakes. I don't think there's any doubt about it. But I also think the people that came after Roosevelt made some mistakes too, in that they didn't develop some of the ideas. Well, there's no doubt about it. Social Security is a great, great thing. But I think at the time it was developed that this was not going to answer all problems as far as retirement was concerned. Maybe the public just didn't get educated to that. Many people thought they were set for the rest of their life, and that's not true. I think the work he did with his conservation camps, and That was nationwide. I mean, that wasn't just one area benefiting it. I imagine our national park system is as great as it is because of the CCC. And there's quite a few young men that learned that there was a way to go through life if you would work. I mean, some of your small town construction people learned or either they didn't learn it all while they were in CC camps, but that's where they realized that this was a field which they could develop and become self-sufficient. Some of the farm programs were good. He wasn't perfect, but I mean he still took a country and gave it back its confidence. I think that's the greatest mark he made on it.
And he had the country during a very difficult period. Not that there aren't lots of difficult periods.
They're all, I think they're probably all very, very difficult.
Exceptionally hard.
And of course he had the charisma. I mean, he could do with a voice on radio. But some people can't do with television.
Did everybody really sit by their radios and listen to the fireside chats?
I think the majority of people did. I mean, I think many Republicans did. I mean, he was entertaining, really. And, real good Republican friends that aren't as unkind to Franklin D. as you might think. They just never gave him much credit. But
maybe in retrospect. What church and organizations have you belonged to in Monticello?
I'm a member of St. Philomena's Catholic Church.
When you were a boy, was that church located, was it the same name that was located?
Yeah, it was called St. Philomena's then, and it's down east of Eisner's Grocery. That was a chapel. And Monticello was never a parish. It was always an out mission. We were in the out mission from being met. There were only about 7 or 10, 12 at the most Catholic families in Monticello when I grew up. Called the shotgun parish. Fire a shotgun through the back door of the church and you probably wouldn't hit anybody. But, of course, what is there, 150 families today or 160 families?
So there's been quite a change.
So that, you say the change is in Monticello. I think our population was around 2,000 when I was growing up. Probably not much more than that when I went away to college. So that would be another thing, would be on the new homes. And you asked me about changes, and I was thinking downtown area. But out south and east of town, of course, that's all new development out there. Those were just corner bean fields when I grew up. And the high school property was you were out of town when you walked across the road. Then, of course, the building area up here in Lone Beach and out west part of town. That would be something that people that hadn't been here for 50 years might be amazed at.
Did you belong to any organizations in town?
Chamber of Commerce and That was it.
Mhm.
Was on the school board at one time. Very short time.
I imagine it would be hard to keep up with too many things and be a doctor.
That's, I couldn't give the time to the school board that I felt somebody else could be doing a much
Mhm.
better job. I think it's right at our beginning of building for new buildings. I didn't realize the school board, those men put in as many hours as they did,
Yeah.
for, I think the town of Monticello has always had an excellent school system. Been superior.
We've been very fortunate. Well, I thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
I enjoyed it very much.